This is one of the scenes from the Ghibli movie Spirited Away, but it's actually 3D. Here's another one, also 3D. How about this one? There are so many YouTube tutorials on how you can create the 2D Studio Ghibli style in 3D, but none of them combine all of them to create a full scene. Is it too hard? Does it take too long? Or is it something you just shouldn't do? Well, while I was creating these 3 scenes, I realized the answer is maybe more complicated than I thought. The first scene looks pretty simple. An island, some clouds, and a lot of water. Looking at the movement, it looks like the shot has been painted in 3 layers. The island in the foreground, the closest clouds in the midground, and the rest of the clouds in the background. And that's pretty simple to recreate in 3D as well. The whole shot has a very painterly feeling, almost like a Bob Ross painting. There are a few different ways to paint in Blender, and for this project I decided to use texture painting. Unfortunately, Blender's default paintbrush looks pretty boring, but there are a few settings you can tweak to give it some more character. I expected very little from these settings, but you can actually customize more than I thought. With a custom brush mask, texture, and pressure sensitivity settings, you can create some pretty good looking stuff. My favorite setting out of all of them is probably the gradient color. This switches between the colors of the gradient based on the pressure you apply to your tablet. This makes it super easy to add some subtle color variation to any surface. And with my selection of brushes ready, it's time to paint. All complex things start very simple. Laying down the most basic colors first will define the silhouettes and shapes of the shot. And that's all you really need to nail the composition. At this point you can already see whether you get close to the original or if you need to make some adjustments. I was feeling pretty good about my layout, so after a quick last check, I went back in and started refining. This is the most fun part of the painting process, at least for me. Now it is time to capture all the intricate details, the variations in color, and the well thought out brush strokes that make the shot look so beautiful. While the big shapes define the overall mood, the details add history to every object. It invites you to think about all these stories that have happened here and really helps you immerse yourself into the world by making it feel like life goes on, whether you are there or not. And after animating the camera as well as the water and repositioning the clouds, the first scene is done. While I was researching all the tricks and techniques that the studio uses to create their movies, I stumbled onto a quote by Hayao Miyazaki, the man behind all the Ghibli movies. I believe that the tool of an animator is the pencil. He's famously known to stay away from computer-generated images as much as possible. So my idea of trying to recreate one of his movies with nothing but a computer is probably not something he would like. But maybe I can show that there are benefits to these newer technologies. If I was better at painting, I think I could have almost perfectly recreated this shot. But I'm not sure that this would be much quicker than doing it traditionally. So this shot alone probably wouldn't be enough to convince Miyazaki. But of course, we're just getting started. Most shots in Spirited Away are separated into 2 art styles. The static objects that don't move throughout the shot and the dynamic ones. And after the first purely static shot, it's time to add some dynamicism. Traditionally, you would have to paint the characters multiple times over multiple frames to create a scene. But in 3D, you only need to create it once and can then use that model for every necessary scene. But the problem with Blender is that it is optimized for realism. So we basically need to trick the program into a more hand-drawn style. For that, we need 3 main ingredients, and the model itself is the foundation for the other 2. Just like the first scene, I started by blocking out her body, then refined it by merging all the individual shapes and adjusted them in scope mode. And for her, the most basic anatomy was enough, since most of it is hidden under clothes anyway. While I was cleaning up the geometry by retopologizing the model, I learned from a few tutorials that the only thing that really matters in non-photorealistic renders is the end result. Very differently to realistic projects, the object's geometry doesn't really matter, which actually gives you a lot more freedom in how to create your project. The The second ingredient for non-photorealistic projects is a great example. Just like most anime or comic styles, Spirited Away also has line art. Chihiro's nose, for example, is only really visible because of a few lines. These extra lines give the characters more structure and make it easier to distinguish between the shirt and hair, for example. In Blender, these lines can be automated. Just add a grease pencil object to your scene and give it the line art modifier. Now you can select what you want to outline and voila! It basically adds a line in front of every sharp edge of the object that is visible to the camera. Now the goal is to change the model in a way that makes the line art look as good as possible. Adding geometry to make them smoother, smoothing out surfaces to remove unnecessary lines, nothing matters except for the final look. And after a few more details, there's only one more ingredient left. Most characters consist of two colors, the base color and the shadow color. No gradient between the two, just a straight line. And all you really need to create that is a super simple shader setup. And there you go, looks pretty good. But if you want to go even further, you can either adjust the geometry again to create more desirable shadows, or if you really want to optimize the model, tweak the normals of the object. Normals tell the surface in which direction it's facing, which is used to calculate the object's shadows, for example. I mainly use that to add some more custom shadows or to get rid of some that aren't in the original. And with 3D Chihiro looking like the original, it's time for her to move like her as well. After creating a custom rig and failing to properly add weight painting the first time around, she's ready to be animated. So with the help of the original, I tried to copy the movement as closely as possible to my version. Until I realized something. Her arms in the original are way too long. The more I tried to trace her movements, the more I noticed how wrong the anatomy actually is. And it's not just the arms. But obviously, without a 3D model to compare it to, it doesn't feel wrong. The position her arms are in the original actually makes it feel more intimate. I guess if you have to draw all the poses manually, you can also change the anatomy a bit to make them more expressive, or to just make it look better visually. Unlike her body, the shirt needs a few more adjustments. Throughout the shot, you can see how the folds in her shirt shift and change. The easiest way to achieve that in 3D is with shape keys. Shape keys basically allow you to change the shape of an object over time. So for her shirt, I create the pose in the beginning, and whenever it reaches the point where it needs to be adjusted, I create a new shape key and adjust it. And once that's done for the whole shot, it looks like the cloth is actually reacting to her movements. The last thing missing is her mouth. And this is where the 3D model fell apart. The shapes her mouth get into in the original really don't work in 3D. On top of that, I also just really suck at rigging a face. The only thing that saved this from being a train wreck were once again shape keys. But even then, to make it look somewhat similar to the final camera view, I really had to push the model to its limits. Luckily, it worked out somehow and looked somewhat decent in the end. Haku follows basically the same process as Chihiro, but I found a few tricks that made him look even better. For these internal lines, for example, I added these extra planes that stick out of the main body. Because of the way the line art modifier works, these will be rendered as simple lines, which made creating his fur a lot easier. For his green mane, for example, I just placed a simple plane on his head and cut a fur shape into it with the knife tool. Another pretty subtle but effective trick is the displacement modifier. With this setup and a simple cloud texture applied to it, the model wobbles around a tiny bit, which means that the characters are never perfectly the same between frames. This subtle imperfection happens in every traditional film, so it's important to add that in 3D as well. The animation is almost done, all that's left now is the last final touch. Since the grease pencil outlines are created automatically, we can now apply them to the animation and adjust them manually. This is also the last moment where any big issues can still be fixed. The automatic lines, for example, aren't perfect, so I cleaned them up a bit. Her mouth still looked a little rough, but that can be fixed as well. And the biggest issue of all, the shadows, which still look a little weird in some moments. I even used this opportunity to add some more details in Chihiro's hair and Haku's fur, which in the end looked like this. The good thing is that you only have to create each character once, which saves a lot of time, but it also has that distinct 3D perfection that you have to fight against to create something that looks more handmade. I guess you could say the 3D version takes less time and is more accurate, but it lacks a bit of freedom when it comes to how you can express emotions and movement. I think for this one it's pretty clear which one Miyazaki would prefer, but I have one more technique I want to try. This scene is kind of a hybrid between the first two. It has the painterly static environment, but this time the characters actually interact with it. To combine both of them, we first need the environment without any dynamic elements. And now we can turn this terrain into a 3D environment. Step 1. Separate the image into a foreground, midground, and background. Step 2. Model the environment very roughly in 3D space. And step 3. Project the original image onto the 3D environment. And there you go. The environment is already done and looks just like the original. Well, because it is. The rings that swing from left to right are also pretty simple. First, I need the ring model itself, which isn't that hard to create. Then I need an extra rail that I can attach the rings to. Placing a cylinder in the same position and projecting the texture onto that basically did the trick. And now I can wrap the rings around it, duplicate them, and rotate them around the pole. Since I have already created Chihiro before, I can just use her in this scene as well. All she's missing right now are her shoes and shorts. I adjusted the pose a bit so that it looks good in camera view and placed an extra lamp in the scene to bring out her lighter colors. And now the last thing missing to really place her in the scene is her shadow. Since the environment itself isn't affected by any lights in the scene, I just model a shadow manually, which is basically just a transparent black plane. Lastly, Chihiro's companion, No Face, wasn't really a challenge either. And all that's missing now is the animation. First, I slightly move the camera from left to right to bring movement into the foreground. Then I bend the midground a bit to add this slight parallax effect you can see through the door. There are definitely benefits to using 3D for your 2D animation work, and you can definitely do it better than what I have created in this project, but I think there's always a certain amount of authenticity and expressiveness that you will miss out on no matter how good you make it. So I might not be able to convince Miyazaki to change his opinion, but maybe that wasn't the best way to approach it anyway. I guess the best use of any given tool is not to try to recreate the style of a different tool, but rather to utilize its strengths to create a look that is inspired by other ways of creating. Imitation can only really get you so far. The best style you can create is still your own style.